Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to pursue a little bit of what I heard from Grand Chief Sethi. Grand Chief, you talked about the rates in northern or remote areas compared to urban centers. And as a member of parliament that serves a very northern remote riding, I'm very curious to drill into that a little bit, just from a I'm not going to pretend I understand much of this. So this is for an education for me to understand some of the things going on in my own riding. I'm going to assume that northern Manitoba maybe is not that different than northern Saskatchewan, where I'm from. So if you would take a few minutes and just expand on your comments about the rates in northern and remote communities compared to more urban centers, and then also on you talked about the points of critical intervention, and I was really intrigued by your comments there, and I want you to flesh that out. I want to give you some time just to talk about that a little bit more, if that's fair. Okay.
Thank you for your question. One of the things that I've always spoken about is the demographics that we live in northern Manitoba. It's very different from southern Manitoba. In Manitoba, we have 15 isolated communities. 85% of each community is unemployed. So there's poverty, lack of resources to help women and victims of domestic violence, and the services are just not there. And women tend to gravitate toward urban centers and then create greater problems because they cannot access employment, they cannot access adequate housing or shelter, and they become victims of a cycle that has been perpetuated by lack of resources and lack of adequate support for them. And I always say that women's shelters are a must in every First Nation. For people running away from domestic violence, they turn to urban centers, they turn to other communities, and then they are led down a path of victimization everywhere they go. So it's a sad state, and we're living in a country that's prosperous. That this situation should not be even in existence, but it is. It's a reality that we live in from day to day.
Could I get you to talk a little bit about just expand on that comment you made about the points of critical intervention? I think you talked about bus stations. You talked about the situations when there's fires or evacuations. You even referenced some cities in my province of Saskatchewan. I think you talked about Saskatoon and Regina. And can I get you just expand on that points of critical intervention and how we might how we might help there? What are some ideas of ways that we could help at those points of critical intervention?
Thank you very much. I think that the supports and the resources needed for people that are transitioning or moving into urban areas, there's a vulnerability there. There are risks there. And we've seen it happen in Winnipeg, where young girls come to Winnipeg for medical appointments and they go missing. And we hear them on the news. We hear it on the news that they have died and become victims because there's not enough support to monitor the transition and the movement of young people. And I think that those are areas of transition, and we need to look at how we can improve the system, and that it's the health system that has a lot to do with that. And because there's not enough resources and support for people that don't know the city life, that don't know the urban life, and they get lost and they become very vulnerable and at risk. And we need to concentrate on those transition points and ensure that there's protection and safety for all.
You know, one of the things that I've had some conversations with people in northern Saskatchewan about is, and one of the results or one of the things we've maybe learned through the pandemic is the ability to provide services through. I mean, like we're sitting here now in a Zoom meeting, and there's some things that we can maybe have learned to use technology for better than we might have in the past, and providing medical services and support to some of the remote communities. Potentially, we've learned some things that might allow us to be better at providing those, so some of those young people don't have to travel to the big urban centers for those kind of. Do you think that's fair to actually think there's maybe some opportunity to improve those services with what we've learned in the last year?
I think it is probably more than ever. Like this pandemic has shed light on the insufficient resources that we have to deal with things where people do not have to move away from the First Nation. And I think that's awareness and prevention would be the key to educating and protecting our young girls and women before they leave their community, that there are pitfalls that they must avoid. They must be informed on how to protect themselves. And maybe I can pass this part of the question on to Hilda, because she works first, like in front lines with these people. So maybe you can answer part of that question, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Well, the pandemic has shown how responsive governments can be. And I think that level of response must continue when we want to, work towards ending all forms of gender and race-based violence against Indigenous women and girls, and to us LGBTQIA plus people. When we look at our communities, especially our First Nation communities that are remote and isolated, we see that there are many barriers that are faced by Indigenous women and girls, and to us LGBTQIA plus people, even men and boys, and which poses many vulnerabilities to them if they're, forced to leave the community to access their basic human rights, to access to health, to food security, even to economic opportunities. And we really need to reflect on how we can improve the lives of Indigenous women and girls, and to us LGBTQIA plus people, so they're not forced into vulnerable situations that could potentially put them at risk of being sex trafficked or go missing or be murdered. So we really need to reflect and build on programs and services that are Indigenous led and rooted in culture.